It is, as always, a pleasure to welcome you here for what we feel will be one of our most engaging and important programs of the year. And I'd like to offer a special welcome to the chair of the Institute's Board of Overseers, Carl Hayden, and another one of our board members, Dr. Gerald Benjamin. I haven't seen Jerry yet. I'm sure he's somewhere in the room, but Carl, I know because of this very, very auspicious occasion, would like to say a few remarks, and so I invite him to the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a great privilege to have Dick Ravitch here. He has been a great and enduring friend of the Rockefeller Institute of Government. You know, when the night is darkest and the problem totally intractable and about to devour us all, New Yorkers do not call Ghostbusters. They call Dick Ravitch. So that concludes the shortest speech I've ever made. Thank you so much, Dick Ravitch.
And before we begin, it gives me great pleasure to bring to the podium for a very special welcome to our wonderful city, the mayor of the city of Albany, the Honorable Kathy Sheehan. Mayor.
Thank you, and it is really a pleasure and an honor to have our former Lieutenant Governor here. He is a person who I greatly admire, whose work as a mayor of a city that has its challenges, his work on the financial and fiscal distress of our cities is something that has been so helpful to me. He's been very gracious. I've had the opportunity to meet with him before I became mayor, and I still went through with it, so I'm sure that he probably thinks I'm a little challenged in that way, but I do want to say that it is just such a privilege to be able to be the host city for this event and other events. That this is an institution that really is such a phenomenal resource in our city. It's one of the things that makes this such a great capital city, and I look forward to what I'm sure is going to be a very fascinating and thought-provoking conversation. So welcome all of you.
Hosting our conversation this afternoon is a very special friend of mine and the Institute's the News and Public Affairs Director of WCNY and host of the Capitol Press Room, Susan Arbetter. And Susan, thank you for being with us, and I promised I would keep it short. Now here to introduce our very special speaker is Rockefeller Institute Senior Fellow and Director of our Fiscal Studies Policy Program, Dr. Don Boyd. Don.
Thank you. You're in for a treat. Dick is insatiable, inquisitive, and fearless. And I know that. I've worked with him and seen all three. If you've ever looked at either Dick's bio or Dick's schedule, you will be exhausted. And I think the two are probably related. That bio was earned. Among other things, over the years, he's been chairman and CEO of the Bowery Savings Bank. In 1975, Governor Hugh Carey requested he assume the chairmanship of the Urban Development Corporation, the UDC, which was nearly bankrupt. He helped restore it to solvency. He played a major role in resolving the problems of the New York City fiscal crisis. We're still early in his career. Beginning in 1979, he served as the chairman of the MTA. In 1988, he was the chairman of the New York City Charter Revision. In 2009, he was appointed lieutenant governor. After done with that, he chaired the with Paul Volcker, co-chaired the State Budget Crisis Task Force, where I had the great pleasure of working with him and for him. So I think you get the point. Dick has an incredible appetite for life and for public policy. That's the long story. The short story, just yesterday and today, interviews with WAMC, WMHT, Capitol Tonight, spoke at Albany Law School, meetings at the Capitol, meetings at Times Union, Newsday, Associated Press. There's more. I'm sure I've left out a few. It's truly extraordinary. I would love to say I hope that I can do that when I'm 80, but honestly, if I could do it now, I would be a thankful man. I can't. It's really something else. I've learned a lot of things from Dick. Rather than take the time to tell you all that, you will quickly learn some of those things. The last thing I would want to say is that Dick is not done teaching people. Just yesterday, Judge Stephen Rhodes in the Detroit bankruptcy case, named Dick as a consultant on issues of municipal finance and viability. Dick said, if I can help, that's better than a dozen more golf games this summer. The order reportedly requires all parties to promptly comply with any of Ravitch's requests. And my advice to those who must comply is get ready, you're going to be busy. So with that, thank you.
This is an incredible treat. On top of all of the other titles, Dick Ravitch is also a great mensch. You write, I was the quintessential participant observer, and you're again playing that role in Detroit. What are you expected to do?
Advise the judge on issues that come up as he considers whether or not to approve the bankruptcy plan that the city is submitting to him as we speak.
A little bit different of a situation that faces you in Detroit than did in New York City in 1975.
Very different. Detroit, far worse shape than New York was. New York, despite all of the problems, was still the center of the financial world, the center of the entertainment world, of the media world. It had enormous strength. It still was a place that people all over the world wanted to come to. It only had one problem. It had been running deficits, and it had solved them by borrowing. And they borrowed year after year, borrowed more and more money with no ability to pay it back other than by reborrowing it. And ultimately the music stopped. So it was a simple problem. And the solution was conceptually simple, and that was to, excuse me, and that was to take all of these $9 billion of short-term debt and convert it to long-term debt so that you didn't have these bullet maturities that created fiscal crises every month. And second of all, to force the city to budget in accordance with GAAP on an accrual basis instead of a cash basis, which we gave the city 4 years, the state gave the city 4 years to accomplish, and it did it in 3. And the city of New York has not had a fiscal crisis since then. And had Detroit been required to budget on an accrual basis years ago, they wouldn't be where they are today.
Detroit may be the poster child, but there are many municipalities around the nation that are seeing the results of cuts to services, an unwillingness to cut mandates or raise taxes enough to raise revenues to the degree needed. As unsustainability becomes the norm, the courts seem to be becoming bigger actors in all of this. And if that continues, is that going to affect our willingness to compromise?
Well, you know, Susan, it's an interesting question. I think the most important motivation that Governor Carey and all of us had in 75 was to avoid bankruptcy, because we didn't want a court to decide how a burden would be shared or allocated. And the reason that ultimately the unions and the banks and the legislature and everybody was prepared to do things ultimately that they swore in the spring they would never do was because everybody recognized that if they failed to compromise and failed to respect that all the other parties were compromising also, that we would end up in a courtroom. And nobody could predict the results. And that was worth avoiding, important to avoid. And there are a lot of things about Governor Carey in my book, and you'll hear several today, but he had a profound understanding of that, and that motivated him a great deal. And the state did things that one would have thought a Republican state Senate would never agree to do, but they did. And they were persuaded by the merits, but they were persuaded by the skill with which the governor dealt with them, and we avoided bankruptcy. So there are a number of California cities in bankruptcy, and there are many more skirting serious danger. There are many cities in this state, and our distinguished mayor here runs one of them that is very, very hard pressed between the mandates and the limitations on state aid, facing very, very tough challenges to maintain an antiquated infrastructure, hire a talented workforce to provide essential services. And these pressures are going to continue. They're not going to abate. There's no fairy godmother in the wings.
Upstate cities like Albany and Syracuse, Yonkers, they have cut as much as they possibly can, and they still are laboring under a tax cap, and yet the mandates are increasing, their costs keep getting more expensive. Will there be a political will to address these mandates before cities like Albany yell uncle?
Well, that, of course, is the $64 question, and I guess my answer is that maybe there'll be more people like the mayor of Albany who come out of a professional world, know how to read a balance sheet, understand how to add and subtract, who go into politics. I often ask the question as to what comes first. I mean, I can tell you what I think the financial community has done in making it easy for states and cities to kick the can down the road by having very creative ways of discounting future revenues to pay for yesterday's expenses. That is not a sustainable course. But in the final analysis, in a democracy, it's the people who get elected, who hire the bankers, who negotiate with the lawyer, with the unions. The real challenge, and there's still time enough before this fiscal problem grows, is how do we get people into politics who are willing to think about maybe we shouldn't put all of the cost of the benefits that I received on my 13 grandchildren. And if we had more politicians who were willing to think about that, there's time enough to change the budgeting process, to move towards a sound system in which your recurring expenses match your recurring revenues. And then the kind of catastrophe wouldn't happen. And the public would have a much better understanding that you cannot get services, adequate services, without paying for it. We seem to be going through a period in our life where nobody in politics is seriously willing to question the wisdom of cutting taxes. It's very popular and perfectly understandable from a human point of view, but the dramatic consequence of doing that isn't as easily understandable to both the investment or reinvestment in the infrastructure or the quality of services. And what's really happened throughout this country is that our retirement obligations and our health care costs have gone up far faster than local and state revenues. And as a consequence, they're crowding out expenditures on infrastructure and on education. Rutgers University published a study recently which showed that the states in the United States have spent $650 million less on pre-K education this last year than they did the year before. Well, I can't think, if you want to disinvest in the future of this country, I can't think of a better way of doing it than shrinking pre-K education. You look at the infrastructure needs around this country, and they're enormous. I always like to tell the story that when I was chairman of the MTA, and we are in desperate need of revenue streams to borrow the money we need to make the system functioning and safe. And there was a lot of reluctance on the part of the state Senate to enact a lot of taxes. Well, how did we get them? We got them because David Rockefeller, the chairman of Chase Bank, Dick Shin, the chairman of Metropolitan Life, Bill Ellinghouse, the chairman of AT&T, called Warren Anderson and said, New York City cannot survive without a safe and sound subway system. Give Ravitch his tax package.
After you
Well,
took
not
them
so
into
bad.
the subway system to show
I
them.
did, at 4:30 one morning. That's right, but, you know, where's that business leadership today?
No one grows up saying, I want to become a municipal finance expert. And I'm betting you didn't either. So tell us a little bit about your childhood and how you came to hold the priorities that you do.
Well, I mean, I grew up in a family that worshiped Franklin Roosevelt. I went to a school smack in the middle of Harlem. I was always determined to devote my life to public service, and I got involved in the civil rights movement. I had extraordinary education at Columbia, where I learned about politics in the most profound way, from people like Lionel Trilling and Jack Barzin and Dick Hofstadter and David Truman, and I was determined when I finished law school in the Army to get a job on the Hill in Washington, which I succeeded in doing, and then decided after a couple of years that when I met the gal that I married, that I wanted to be able to earn some money and develop a little economic security and go back into public service when I had a little more financial independence. And I had the opportunity to go into a business that was totally consistent with what my intellectual and social interests were. I went into the building business and ended up building, this sounds very self-serving, forgive me, but I ended up building the first racially integrated housing ever built in Washington, D.C., and I built about 40,000 affordable apartments in New York, most for others, not for my own account. And then I developed, as a result of that, a lot of knowledge about housing finance, and I had privately predicted that UDC, which was created by Rockefeller to be a proactive developer and user of state tax-exempt financing under the private housing finance law in New York State, was broke. And when Hugh Carey was sworn in as governor, and I did not know him beforehand, he was told that within a week of his taking office that the banks would no longer underwrite the notes and bonds of UDC. So he asked around who was an expert on housing finance, and he happened to ask two people who knew me. One was his counsel, Judah Gribbets, and the other was Bob Weaver, who was the first secretary of HUD, whom he knew in his Washington days when he was on the Ways and Means Committee. And Bob Weaver was the first black secretary, or first black member of the cabinet in the United States. He was also the first tenant that moved into Waterside, into Capitol Park
Washington.
Apartments in Washington. You know. So that changed. But I have to say that everything that happened subsequently would not have happened with anybody else other than Hugh Carey.
Why?
First of all, he was so damn smart. This was a man who understood the financial complexities of all of this. And at the same time, he had the capacity to sit and talk with Walter Wriston, and an hour later, sit down and talk with Meade Esposito, the head of the Brooklyn Democratic Organization. And he was equally comfortable in talking with both. He was neither, and they both respected him. And he was not obsequious. He maintained the dignity of his office and of his own character, no matter who he was dealing with. And he had this incredible capacity to make the right decisions and pick the right people. And if you think about it, the four people that were closest to him in the first 6 months of that year were David Burke, who tragically died just the other day, was his secretary, whom he'd never met before. Dave Burke had worked for the Kennedys and and I think it was Teddy Kennedy who recommended him to Governor Carey. Judah Gribbetts he had never met before. Judah had been deputy mayor of the city under a Beam. Peter Goldmark, who was then the commissioner of welfare in the state of Massachusetts. He never met Peter Goldmark before he became his budget director. And not only had he never met me, I had refused to give him a contribution when he ran for office. And it was the four of us who spent a lot of time with him during the first year of his office. And I mean, I could regale you with stories about what an extraordinary man he was. I mean, he never...
Regale us with one.
Well, I tell some of the people at lunch story, but at a certain point when the banks were being very recalcitrant in the UDC crisis, and there was a $100 million note that was due on February 25th, and UDC was financing and constructing 30,000 units of affordable housing. And we said to the banks, lend us the money to finish the housing, and then there'll be enough revenue to service the debt. But we can't finish the housing. We needed $700 million without the loan, and we provided a way of giving them a security interest in a stream of revenue that made it a creditworthy loan, and they said no. And I had a bankruptcy petition prepared, and I had sent out, and with the governor's consent, obviously, and all the bankers were invited to the governor's office at 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. And at everybody's place was going to be a bankruptcy petition. Oh, I left out one thing. The banks were furious at us, and they set off against all UDC's bank accounts, so we couldn't make payroll. And when they set off, in other words, globbed onto all the bank deposits, that's when we decided we were going to play chicken, and we prepared a bankruptcy petition. And they were all coming to the governor's office at 2 o'clock on Sunday. And on Saturday afternoon, I got scared. And I sort of pinched myself and I said, my God, I mean, am I really qualified to make these kind of judgments? And I called the governor. And there was a restaurant on 52nd Street, restaurant and bar that he loved. I don't know why, because it was crummy as far as I was concerned. No, I loved it. Called Rose's Restaurant. So I went to Rose's Restaurant and I said, Governor, I said, I can't tell you how flattered I am and the confidence you reposited in me, but we're making a very fateful decision tomorrow, and I think maybe you ought to get somebody with more gray hair than I have to make the decision. And the governor looked at me and he said, you know, he says, I bet on you, and I'm sticking with my bet. Now, I mean, that's a hell of a thing. And that, I mean, every other story is like that. I mean, he never told me who to hire. I called him once. I tell some people at lunch the story. I hired a new president of Long Island Railroad. I had to pay him $105,000 a year, and I thought I owed the governor the courtesy of telling him before he read about it in the paper. So I called him, and when I told him, he said, $105,000, that's more than I make. And I said, well, Governor, that's what I want you to know before you read it in the paper. And there was silence, and he said, I guess he had a better year than I did. Anyway.
The moment with the banks wasn't the only hairy moment during the resolution of the fiscal crisis. There was also a moment over Chinese food, I think, with Albert Shanker.
Not Chinese food.
I'm sorry.
No food, as a matter of fact. Now, that's a great story. The governor asked me to go down to Washington and brief the staff of the Senate and House banking committees, which I did on October 16th with Dave Burke and Peter Goldmark. And there had been established a schedule in which as every city note maturity was coming due, there was a tentative agreement, not an enforceable agreement, that pension funds would buy MAC bonds to replace these maturing notes, and in some instances, pension funds, in other instances, financial institutions. So, the next day, there was, I think, 150 million, if I remember the number correctly, note maturing, and the teachers' pension fund in New York was scheduled to buy $150 million of MAC bonds so the notes could be paid off. And Dave and Peter and I arrived back at LaGuardia, and Dave called the governor from the airport just to check in and tell him we're back, and governor said it's all over because Shanker called to say the teachers were not making the investment the next day. I was terribly shook up because the state had not made adequate provision in the event of bankruptcy, because if there was a default, the people would have presented the notes for payment, and you would have seen the beginning of the dismemberment of New York City's assets. So you would have had to file bankruptcy to avoid a catastrophe. And not that bankruptcy wasn't another kind of catastrophe. And so I went off to a dinner that I was meeting my wife at that was a particularly opulent dinner, which I thought I was very uncomfortable. I couldn't stay, so I went home and got into bed, and about 10 o'clock, governor calls. He's come to the office. Went, got dressed, went down, and he was in white tie and tails. He'd just come from the Al Smith dinner. And he says, Dick, you got to find Al Shanker and get him to change his mind. There's a police car downstairs. I'll take you wherever you want to go. So I happen to know Al Shanker, and the reason I happen to know Al Shanker, the governor didn't know. How he knew I had a friendship with Al Shanker is beyond me, but my friendship with Al Shanker came about because we were both on the board of the A. Philip Randolph Institute, which was located in the offices of the UFT. So it had nothing to do with fiscal stuff or anything else. And Al and I were indeed friends. So I found out, I got a hold from various people of a number, it's now close to 11 o'clock, and I met Al Shanker in his apartment. And I said, or he said to me, you know, he said, I have two responsibilities. I have a responsibility to retirees. And if I invest their money in a bad obligation, I will have done a dreadful thing. I have fiduciary obligations as the de facto trustee of this fund. Can you guarantee me that these bonds will be paid? Also, we own a lot of other city bonds, general obligation bonds, and the MAC bonds took away some of the security of the old city bonds. So painful as it is, I don't see how I can do it. And we stayed up until 5 o'clock in the morning talking about individual responsibilities in a situation like that. And I told him it was a risk and his membership would be in jeopardy either way. And he said, I have to think about it. I have to talk to some people, and I'll call you at home. So I went home about 6 o'clock, and I shaved. I was crazy, and I kept thinking, what's going to happen that day? And I turned on the television set, and about 9 o'clock in the morning, I'm sorry for the details, but it's sort of a fun story. The story came over television. We interrupt this broadcast to tell you that it has been learned that the city of New York is going to have to file bankruptcy today. I still hadn't heard from Shanker. So I got in a cab and went down to the governor's office, which was at 55th Street off 6th Avenue. And the press was there en masse. And I walk into his office, and just then the secretary says, Dick, Mr. Shanker's calling you. I pick up the phone and Shanker says, I want to meet with you and the governor and no one else, and I'm not coming to the governor's office. I said, where are you, Al? He said, I'm at Gracie Mansion, which was at 88th Street and East River. And I then lived at 85th Street on the east side, so I said, I will tell you what, we'll meet you at my apartment. And the governor and I went down the back stairs of the office building, got into an unmarked police car, and we went up to my apartment, and Al arrived with former Mayor Wagner and Harry Van Arsdale, who was head of the Central Labor Council. And there then ensued 5 hours of discussion. And Judah joined us, and Dave Burke joined us, and Al's deputy, Sandy Feldman, and then Cy Rifkin, who was counsel, joined. And there was both a serious discussion, and Judah kept saying to me, don't let Kerry and Shanker talk alone, because the teacher's contract was the first contract to be reviewed by the Financial Control Board, which had been set up. And everybody except me was suspicious that Shanker wanted to trade and make sure his contract got approved. But I knew Shanker well enough to know he wasn't going to ask, and I knew Hugh Carey well enough to know that Hugh Carey would not make that trade. This was a real matter of principle. And of course, Shanker never asked, and the governor never asked. And finally, at about 1 o'clock, Shanker said he agreed to do it. And the governor left, and Shanker left, and I'm sitting there, and it's now 1:30 in my apartment, and I remember Harry Van Arsdale found a box of matzah in my kitchen, and there were matzah crumbs all over my living room because he was a slob. And, I suddenly realized that people were going to the banks to present these notes for payment. I tried to call the governor, and I was told he was out and unreachable. And so I called the banking superintendent, who just passed away. I forget her name. Do you remember, Pete? Muriel Siebert. And I said, Muriel, how do we keep the banks open? She said, I only have jurisdiction over Manny-Hanny. The way you keep the rest of the banks open is you have to get the controller of the currency in Washington. And what do I know about controllers of the currency? So I said, how do you get to the controller of the currency? So you got to get to the head of the clearinghouse. And I said, who's the head of the clearinghouse? Said, Pat Patterson, the chairman of the Morgan Bank. So I put a call in to the chairman of the Morgan Bank. The Ravitches were not used to hobnobbing with Pattersons. I told the secretary that it was a matter of some urgency, and she said, well, you don't understand, Mr. Patterson can't possibly talk to you. The city of New York's going broke today. And I said, well, tell him the governor just left my apartment, and I think he'll want to talk to me instantly. So he called me, he got on the phone, and I said, Mr. Patterson, I don't know if you remember, we met the day in the governor's office when you told him that you would no longer lend the city of New York any money. That was May 2nd, 1975. And he was sort of grumpy. And make a long story short, the bank stayed open. And that we got through that day. And then nonetheless, Jerry Ford made a speech in which he said there was no way the federal government would help a profligate city like New York. And there was a lot of rectitude and all kinds of political messages in his statement. And Governor Carey was very friendly with the Secretary of Defense, Mel Laird, who had been a colleague of Hugh Carey's in the House of Representatives. And Hugh Carey told me that he called Mel Laird and said, let's play golf. And he went to Washington, no publicity, and he had a golf game with Mel Laird at the famous National, whatever it's called, golf club in Washington, D.C. Did you ever hear this story? Congressional. Did you hear this story? Yeah. And who knows what he said. But he then established a fairly regular communication with Mel Laird, and which helped. It wasn't decisive because Bill Simon, who was the Secretary of Treasury, who made a fortune underwriting all that crappy New York paper, nonetheless was full of rectitude about New York City, didn't want to help. But ultimately, for a lot of reasons, which there isn't time to go into today, ultimately the federal government helped. And as I look back on it, and this was very important motivation for me to write in writing this book, because this story has never been told. Both Hugh Carey and Jerry Ford did exactly what the right thing to do was, but more importantly, they did it at the most opportune time. The president waited until New York State had reached the ultimate limits of what it was capable of doing, and the governor didn't commit the state to things until a lot of other events had run its course. So it was only, they were both politically smart and sophisticated, and there was never any hostility between the two of them.
I was struck.
Sorry for the long story.
It's fascinating. I was struck by the number of times over the course of your career that you allowed elected officials, politicians, and union leaders to publicly lambaste you or publicly outmaneuver you in order to get what you wanted. Like John, is it John Law of the MTA?
Yeah.
And Stanley Fink over the fare increases?
Well, Stanley Fink was exceptional in every respect. A spectacular politician, a deeply caring man about the city, and a wonderful friend. And the fact that I could have a confidential relationship with the Speaker of the Assembly, which irritated the hell out of the governor's staff, I have to tell you, was a major factor in what we were able to accomplish for the MTA. But I really met Bob Wagner after he had finished his mayoralty. And he was very nice to me, and we would have lunch occasionally. And he once, when I became chairman of the MTA, invited me for lunch, and he said, "Can I offer you a little bit of advice about labor negotiations?" And I said, "Absolutely," because there was a Long Island Railroad strike a couple of weeks later, and then everybody knew the transit workers' contract was up in a few months. And he said, "Dick, if you want to serve the public best, the only way you can do that, get the best possible deal, is by helping the union leader look good and you to look bad. And you'll save the public a lot of money if you're willing to do that." And that was the wisest advice I got, and that's what I did in the transit negotiations.
It was staged.
It was staged, yes, and Ed Koch stood on the Brooklyn Bridge cursing me for giving away the store and all of that, but never affected my friendship with Ed either.
You described a time when you circumvented the open meetings law by putting half of the MTA board in the Century Club and half of them in the Yale Club, so there wouldn't be a quorum, so it didn't have to be open to the public, and you ran from one to the other.
That's right. That came about because I had to raise the fare. I wanted to make sure I had the votes on the board. I didn't know where the mayor was going to come out. So, and he had 4 votes, and I didn't know people that well. I'd only been there a few months. So I invited everybody to dinner at a club that I belonged to. And Carol Bellamy was on my board. She was then president of the city council. And though we became good friends, she had the foulest mouth of any woman I'd ever met in my entire life. And she calls me on the phone, and I will not repeat it, the language she used, but she suggested that I was out of my blankety-blank mind to think that she would show up at a club that didn't admit women. And my wise counsel said to me, Carol's the kind of person who's going to call the press, and if it's in the press that you have a dinner meeting, that violates the open meetings law, and therefore the strap hangers will get an injunction when you raise the fare. I said, oh my God, what do I do? So I got a room at the Yale Club, which was 4 blocks away, and I had half the board members there and half at the Century Club, and I ran back and forth all night until I was sure I had the votes.
Well, you don't mention specific good government groups. You do mention a kind of obsession with transparency in Albany that gets in the way of good policy making. Is there too much of a priority placed on transparency here?
I don't think I said that. I certainly didn't mean that. I'm all for transparency. What I did say was that the idea that meetings between the governor and the legislative leaders had to be public and open to the press was utter nonsense. Nothing was said at those meetings that they didn't want in the public media. And that's not a way for people with different constituencies and different points of view to resolve their differences. So, that's kind of silly. I think the press is, you'll forgive me, Susan, you don't fall into this category, but so much of the press thinks politics is a dirty word, thinks there's some other mystical way that one can govern in a democracy without politics. And absolutely silly. And being a legislator is not necessarily the best life. 5 or 6 months out of the year, you're in a different location from your family. Your pay is a fraction of what it would be if you were doing something in the commercial world successfully. You're constantly accused of having inappropriate motives. You can't please everybody all the time, and there's an indignation of the media that makes you feel as if you're not as worthy as citizens who condemn politics. So it's not an atmosphere which is conducive to attracting the best possible people. It's not the transparency I object to. I object to the idea that politicians can't negotiate in secret. They should. They always do anyway. These laws don't change the real world at all. They just double the amount of time that's necessary to accomplish what otherwise could be accomplished in half the time.
Albany does attract some great people, but you say that even though people's lives are more directly affected by state politics than national politics, things at the state level are sort of less sexy, and they're the farm team to Washington's big leagues. Can you assess what you saw when you came to Albany in '09?
Well, in '09, there was a great fiscal problem, obviously, the budget problem. People said it was caused by what some like to call a recession, what I call the fiscal collapse of our monetary institutions in 2008. But the reasons for the severity of the problem were not just what happened to the decline in tax revenue because of the events of 2008. It was years of pushing expenses off to the future that caught up with you. The controller wrote a paper in which he pointed out that New York had used, if I remember the number, about $27 billion of one-shots to balance its budget. And interestingly enough, the guys in the budget division, who I had a lot of respect for, told me that this was not a sustainable course. And yet, everybody's instinct at that point was to solve the problem by more borrowing. I didn't think that was right, and I said so, but nobody listened.
in retrospect, if you had to do it all over again, would you have said no to David Patterson when he asked if you would be lieutenant governor? You were clearly frustrated.
No, I wouldn't have said no. You know, first of all, there is probably I've said no to a few things in public life because they were really totally out of sorts with my personal life at the time. But it's been very hard for me to say no to a public service where I thought I could make a difference. So I probably would have said yes. I made some very nice friends, some of whom are in this room, as having spent that year and a half, and I hope that I was able at least to contribute a little bit to the public dialogue. But what it did, most important of all, it made me understand that what was happening in New York could well be happening all over the country, and that's what led to the creation of the task force with my friend Paul Volcker, to my dear friendship with Don Boyd and the Rockefeller Institute, and the Federal Reserve System, and the Treasury Department, and the Council of Economic Advisors, which has been a wonderful learning curve for me, and I hope that some of what we've been able to share is going to have an impact on politics and public education on this subject.
This is my last question, and then we'll open it up to the crowd. The most inspiring thought in the book for me is when you say we all have it within our power to ameliorate whatever ticks us off. That we can't just sit back and bitch, basically. We have to do something about it because this is a democracy and that is our responsibility. What lessons would you like to impart, this book to impart to the people here?
I think one important lesson, and that is we have promised more to the people of this country than we can afford under the present general level of revenue collection. Those promises made in good faith, honorably. Some people think the way to solve the problem is to reduce the benefits, the retirement benefits to public employees. And you have governors who have argued for that very vigorously, and who want to do it on a non-consensual basis. You have people who think that the federal government should be able to write unlimited quantities of checks to solve the problem, or whatever it wants. It's a much more complicated problem than that, and it's only going to be resolved if the people in politics are willing to ultimately come to some kind of consensual arrangement of how we deal with this great fiscal crunch. And so I care about one thing. I care about the press being better educated about how to report on this subject, and I care about the quality of people who are willing to run for office. And I think that's most important. And if everybody focused on that, and people were willing to run. I ran for office once. I was a lousy candidate, but it was an exhilarating experience, and I loved it. And everywhere I went in the city, and I was at subway stations at 5:30 in the morning, and it was exhausting, and I was at schools and social clubs and birth control clinics, and I learned more in those 5 months, and people were uniformly civil and decent. It was an exhilarating experience. I ran for mayor in a year in which ultimately Dinkins and Koch ran as well, and it became a Koch-Dinkins race. And I have to tell you a great story. And Dinkins won, and the night after the primary, Ed Koch and I had dinner at a Chinese restaurant, which we like to go to from time to time. And a woman comes over to me and she said, "Mr. Ravitch, I'm so sorry you didn't win. I voted for you. I wish I could have voted for you for 10 times." She goes on, and Koch is looking up at her like this. And finally, after these effusive comments, Koch looks up to her and says, "What am I, chopped liver?" In any event, kidding aside, it's a wonderful experience. More people ought to try it. You don't need everybody to be a scholar or an expert or have studied at the Rockefeller Institute, but you need people who are willing to say, "Hey, I don't really understand this damn pension system. And maybe there's a guy by the name of Boyd over at the Rockefeller Institute who does, and it's worth taking a couple of hours of my time to learn about it." That's all you need, because once people understand it, then all of a sudden they recognize that they have a choice. And legislative leadership, ultimately, it doesn't survive unless it's responsive to its members in some way or another. So you can affect change, you really can, and there are probably, I don't know, a couple of 100,000 people in the United States, if they got active in politics, who aren't currently active. And I'm going to tell you about just writing checks, because that's easy, particularly for rich people and unions to do. But, I mean, to really get involved in the trenches in politics and provide young people with some sense that this is a noble endeavor and not a demeaning endeavor, it would make a world of difference. Because we've solved, as I've said elsewhere, we've solved much bigger problems in this society. We won a war, we beat the Russians in a nasty competition. We ended 150 years of racial segregation in this country. We can solve this problem, but it's going to require very strong leadership. Otherwise, you're going to see more and more Chapter 9 filings and a lot more tensions between public employees and financial institutions.
Thank you.
Mr. Ravitch,
Yes, I hear you.
you hear me. I'm wondering, this regards the MTA, I'm wondering what you think of the long-range implications for the continuation of borrowing with fair-backed bonds to fund capital improvement projects. In your day, there were appropriations for capital improvement projects. I believe Governor Pataki stopped that practice.
No, sir. There were three sources of financing that I put in place at the MTA. One was the fare box back bond, and which simply means that the revenues that the MTA received, which are both fare box revenues and government subsidies, are part of the revenues that come into the MTA. So that they are then the credit of the MTA is the security, if you will, for the bonds, and therefore the buying public, the underwriters, the rating agencies, have to be convinced that there's enough revenue to pay both the operations of the system and to service the debt. There were two other kinds of revenue. One was where there was a specific tax enacted, and that tax revenue was the sole security for the bondholder, for the lender. And the third was a contract bond in which the state agreed to pay a certain amount of money every year, and that promise, even though it was subject to annual appropriation by the legislature, that promise was hockable, if you will. So, and those are still the methods used by the MTA, and they shouldn't change. The problem is, and it's very real, the MTA, for reasons that I can only imagine, voluntarily offered to reduce its revenues recently, which I think breached their fiduciary obligation, the board's obligation, Second of all, I do not know after this last labor settlement whether they're going to have enough revenue to finance their next 5-year capital plan. And that's a great concern, I know, internally to the professional people at the authority. But you need a continuing stream of revenue to support the debt. And you need, I said this when I chaired a commission in 2009 on this subject, that your recurring fare revenue should be sufficient to cover your operating expenses.
There's also one other thing, a story you may have never told in public, and that is about your departure from the MTA. My recollection is that there was a bid for a contract for steel for redecking, I think it was the Throgs Neck Bridge. Kawasaki, Japanese company, came in the low bid. The governor wanted the contract to go to a company in Tonawanda, New York. And I recall reading that you were quoted saying, "You do what's best for the strap hangers." Do you want to tell that story?
Sure. The governor wasn't talking to me at that time, but the law required me to award a contract to the lowest bidder. And the Tri-Borough Bridge and Tunnel Authority's revenues were a major source of collateral for the borrowing that I had to do to get $3 billion worth of new subway cars. So every dollar of TBTA revenues that I spent on things that I didn't have to spend on reduced the number of subway cars I could buy. So both the requirement that I give the contract to the lowest bidder and the compulsion to get the most credit caused me to award the contract. We didn't even think twice about it. It wasn't even a debatable subject internally. And then the first I heard that the governor didn't like it was he wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times criticizing me for it. And one can choose to communicate in all different kinds of ways in this world, I guess. And I wrote an op-ed piece back. So
And the
at least
governor at the time was?
Mario Cuomo. So we did communicate, but only through the newspaper.
Raise your hand if you have questions. Over here.
Hi there. I guess it's on, is it? Well, you brought back a lot of memories. My first job in the budget division was working on UDC and bonding and trying to get us out of that crisis. Moving ahead to today, looking at, local governments and the budgetary limitations they're under, what do you think about casinos as an economic development tool?
I have to tell you, I have no expertise at that. I'm not a gambler. I do know from reading a lot of things that that the majority of people who work the slot machines and whatnot are hardworking, poor people who hope that they'll be lucky enough to take some of their earnings and turn it into a larger amount of money. So I don't think there's any right or wrong about it. My values, which could well be wrong, are, it seems to me, a form of taxing the poor. And I think reducing taxes on the rich and taxing the poor more are not the right answer for America's problems at this point. But I could be wrong.
Raise your hands if you have questions. Right here.
Throughout your discussion, you mentioned the nobility of public service and gave numerous examples of how compromise worked to resolve the difficulties that you were experiencing at the time, or we all were experiencing. Suggestions on how we go about beginning to restore that sense of nobility to service or encourage that art of compromise?
I've thought about that a lot, and I don't have a very good answer for it. I think you do it through education. And I think you do it through, and I point out in the book that the shrinking of the print media has had a devastating impact on politics. Because the knowledge that people have comes now from sources that are not, on the whole, subject to any kind of verification. You read something in the Albany Times Union, it's fact-checked, and therefore probably true, or the New York Times. But the number of people who get their information from journals where that kind of fact-checking goes on is a small percentage. And I don't know what you do about that except try to get the new media more and more educated about these complicated public problems, which all come down to a question about how do we allocate the costs and benefits in this society, the burdens and benefits. I don't think there's any magic way, and I certainly don't have a good answer. I have from time to time done some teaching. I have a lot of young people who come to me for advice about careers, and I urge them, I say, to public service, go down to Washington and work for at least for a couple of years and really learn how the system works and how our country works, and come up to Albany. I just learned this morning that a very talented young man I know, who's, I guess, a junior in college, is working this summer at the Times Union because he's interested in politics. Well, he's not going to be a journalist, I don't think, but he's going to end up being somebody who's going to be interested in government. And I think we have to encourage people to do that.
Was there ever a time during your tenure as lieutenant governor when there was any consideration that you might have to take over the governorship?
Well, I think, as I recall, when David Patterson, in my view, got a sort of a raw deal from the press. They really heaped it on him for things that were perhaps at worst sloppy, but not malevolent. But the media sort of treated him as if he was a really bad person. So there was a period, a week, where there was considerable speculation that he was going to have to resign. And but it didn't change what I did, which wasn't very much to begin with as lieutenant governor. But no, that was not relevant to anything. It weakened David in terms of his ability, and if you recall, the whole budget process that summer was sloppy and not constructive. But that was not just his fault. Everybody was maneuvering themselves for the November elections. And there wasn't strong leadership in the Senate either, to say the least.
That week, did the Attorney General call you to see who you would appoint to be Lieutenant Governor if you were?
He did, and I assured him that if that were to happen, I would not appoint anybody without his consent, since he was clearly going to be the next governor.
How, I'm sorry, over here? Right over here?
So I have a question actually about and sort of the role of the state and the city in terms of raising revenue. We live in a home rule state, and the cities really don't have a lot of control over their ability to raise significant revenue. And just your thoughts on that, and really what does it mean to change that structure? Because it's a structure, it's a structural issue, and you're either for or against it in many regards.
Well, do you mean the structure of requiring the state to approve the enactment of revenues other than the property tax? No, I think that's a good thing on the whole. And I'll tell you why. Because I think that there has to be some check. You could have the politics, the demographics and politics in the city that was totally unresponsive to the impact of confiscatory levels of taxation. And I think having the state have a say in it was not inappropriate. I think as we face this changing world where the percentage of the money that government spends on retirement benefits and health care is now constitutes an ever increasing percentage of what government spends, period, that we ought to rethink several things about our revenue system. Is our reliance on the property tax the best way to, and the fairest way to raise revenue? Is it necessary to give tax breaks to businesses in order to keep them here? I mean, ultimately, it's self-defeating because you can't spend all your money getting people to stay here because then they'll have no revenue at all. Things like the movie tax credit and brownfields there are many others. We really reached a point in the United States where we have this, what I think is sort of Kafkaesque system of states spending a lot of money to induce somebody to either sell in their state or move into their state from another place. I remember in the 70s when Jimmy Carter was president, there was a program called the UDAG program, Urban Development Action Grants, and the state of New Jersey spent all their UDAG money to bribe businesses to move from New York across the Hudson River to New Jersey. What a waste of federal money. The state of Washington just wrote a multi-billion-dollar check to the Boeing Aircraft Company to prevent them from moving to North Carolina. That is not a productive use of taxpayer resources. I mean, I understand what motivated them with a tremendous unemployment in the state of Washington as they left, but it's a crazy system. I remember once, I think I told somebody earlier today this story, I was giving a speech and somebody said, you know, Ravitch, sounds as if you want to raise taxes, and if you raise taxes, we're all going to move to Las Vegas. So I thought for a second, and I said, well, you know what? If everybody moves to Las Vegas, then they're going to have to build a subway system. And then we'll have 2 more senators who will vote for mass transit aid. I do think that we're at a point where, and I think it requires presidential leadership, frankly, to sort of re-examine where we are. The new chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, whom I don't know well, but grew up in New York and spent a lot of time as a youth, he told me, at the Strand bookstore. So the man has a great deal of intellectual curiosity, and hopefully a guy in that position, and hopefully will remain in that position after this fall's election, can begin, I think, might be willing to begin to raise some of these questions from a public policy point of view. But as you well know, to get it back to education, we have never spent in New York State the money that the Court of Appeals required that we spend to produce the equity among school districts, because nobody wanted to push the envelope too hard because resources were limited. But how you apportion the cost of education between the 3 levels of government is another question that is, every state has a different answer. The difference in the level of spending, particularly for early childhood education around this country, is quite significant because the politics of the tax base and from state to state is so different. Nobody can really provide an adequate educational system just on the basis of local property tax.
In the area of public pensions, I think probably the bulk of, say, state and maybe federal pensions are at a fairly low level. But there is a growing sector in the political and educational sector, there is a growing rise in the level of pensions where you have 200...
Pension what? I'm sorry.
Pardon?
I didn't hear the last word you said.
There's a growth in the level of pensions in some sectors where you have pensions in the $200,000 range and maybe more. What would you think of having a inflation-adjusted cap on public pensions?
Well, let me say a couple of things about that. Number one, part of this whole process that I'm describing of the ease and convenience for politicians to postpone the payment of money led, amongst other things, that in collective bargaining situations, workers did not get the increase in current compensation that they sought, but got greater future benefits. Those were bargained in good faith under laws, collective bargaining laws. And as I said earlier, I'd be hard put to pass a law to abrogate that obligation. What I have suggested is that they are creditors. There are all kinds of other creditors, and that they're all going to have to contribute to solve this problem. So it's the taxpayer, the money creditors, the trade creditors. Everybody has to, but it has to be consensual. And I don't know if that's responsive to your question. I think that there are many efforts to reform pension systems in jurisdictions where the underfunding is so dramatic that pension benefits will never be paid. And as we learned in the Detroit case, where the courts have held, and I think accurately, that the bankruptcy statute preempts any state legislative or constitutional guarantee of the payment of pension benefits. That's probably, at least in the minds of the legal scholars I've talked to, probably a correct decision. Now, that doesn't apply to a state because the state can't file bankruptcy because of the 11th Amendment to the Constitution. So you have growing conflicts between municipal employees in a state and the employees of the state themselves. So that's why there isn't a simple answer to this. It requires negotiation and leadership. And I think some people are trying to do that. And it's very tough for a union leader to make a concession and keep his or her job unless they can point to other parties making concessions as well. When Gottbaum and Shanker agreed to all the concessions they did in 1975 in the city, it was because they could tell their members that, look, if we end up at, these bastards will put us into bankruptcy if we don't agree. And if we go into bankruptcy, then that automatically abrogates all our collective bargaining agreements. And so you won't be a union anymore. So it was the very severity of that made them. They were also publicly responsible people, but they were, in the best sense of the word, politicians. They had a constituency that paid their salaries, and they had to have their constituency supportive of the actions they took, and they agreed to pension modifications, salary freezes, job losses. They agreed to things that would be unheard of today in a collective bargaining agreement. But they came out fine, and they've regained a bit of what they lost in those days. Yes, sir.
Something you touched on earlier, but we all know in the paper today we have Governor Perry up trying to poach jobs out of New York to go down to Texas. And my mind's eye goes back to the 1980s when Daniel Patrick Moynihan came out with the then shocking number that the balance of payments, for want of a better term, between the state of New York and Washington, D.C., and what comes back in one form or another in aid, jobs, or what have you, was about $20 billion. And in those days, it was somewhat justifiable with the undeveloped South with tremendous needs at all different levels. Today, the South is not as undeveloped as it was, particularly states like Florida and Texas, and our voice keeps getting lesser as the population moves south. And I wonder why we never hear anymore about that deficit of money coming back from Washington. That I've talked to some people, like on our Ways and Means staff, who have talked that it is probably triple that amount of $20 billion now, if not more. And our voice is not as strong as it was, and none of our leaders seem to be beating that particular drum. And meanwhile, what we do is we have to raise taxes or leave the cities, counties, and school districts to raise their taxes, while down south, having a more favorable balance of payments, if you will, with Washington, they can afford to give tax cuts and all kinds of fiscal attractions for people to move from the north to the south. That issue was a hot issue at one time, and it seems to have disappeared, and yet it seems like it might be a most appropriate thing to dialogue.
Well, I agree. I have a couple of things to say. I don't recall reading in the last month any real debate in the legislature in this city, in the state legislature, about tax cutting. Seemed to be a fairly uniform consensus to that. So if in fact there was a real sense of New York not faring well, then maybe that argument should be made by our state government. Second of all, yeah, Pat Moynihan did that. He had an annual publication in which he reported all of that. I think it was continued for quite a while by the Kennedy School, the same endeavor in a published manner. But Pat Moynihan, two things. He and Dick Bacon, who founded the Rockefeller Institute, were able, interestingly enough, to persuade Richard Nixon in 1969 that the federal government was a much more efficient tax collector than state and local governments, and that therefore there ought to be a general revenue sharing scheme which gave federal money collected through taxes to states essentially based on population. It was eminently rational, and a Republican president put it into effect. Unfortunately, it evanesced over years because there was not a powerful political constituency that became a supporter of that, because you had people advocating expenditures on education or health care, and they spent a lot of money lobbying, etc. But as K Street, Washington became the shadow government, frankly, the supporters of general revenue sharing were not around, and the program evanesced, but the principle is correct. The other thing is, Pat ultimately came to the conclusion that the lack of equity and the lack of connection between need and federal expenditure was James Madison's fault. Because he said, we have 2 senators from Mississippi and 2 senators from New York, and that's James Madison's fault. We can't do anything about that anymore.
During the course of the past 2 days, as the Lieutenant Governor was up here, more than one person had said every time you get together with Dick Ravitch, it's like going to school. And in that regard, Dick, thank you so much for allowing us in your class, and to the ultimate teacher's aide, Susan Arbetter, thank you as always.
Thank you.